here's the wacky theory, as the drum roll toward my unveiling it continues. I actually talked about it in a lecture that we can link to that I did at Union Theological Seminary in the spring. But so in a way, what my scenario involves is the possibility that consciousness, subjective experience, is epiphenomenal, I guess, until animals achieve a human level of self-awareness and linguistic proficiency or something, at which point, one way or another, it starts leading to reports of it. I guess you have to grant that. So it's a kind of a, if you want to say that our talking about consciousness or how we feel inside is consciousness influencing the world, I guess my scenario involves that kind of thing not being possible until you get to a particular point in evolution. I don't think it's easy to sketch that out in much detail, but it's I'll have to stipulate that. Okay, it's at least conceivable in a very vague sense. So anyway, here's the idea, and it involves the idea that evolution itself, the history of life on this planet itself, has a purpose in some sense. Now, I want to emphasize this doesn't imply any spooky forces like the intelligent design people talk about. We're talking about nuts and bolts natural selection, and the premise is actually natural selection is fairly likely to eventually lead to intelligent life, which in turn is fairly likely to lead to a cultural evolution that then leads the species to eventually enmesh itself in technology and get to where we are. We are on the verge of this giant global brain. So it's a nuts and bolts process that got us here. It's not spooky in that sense, but in some sense or another, purpose was imparted to the process. And you can imagine a deistic God. You can imagine space aliens. You can even imagine a simple process of cosmic natural selection among universes leading to this. I won't get into that right now. But anyway, the idea is that, once we start, if you view the purpose of the whole system as getting to higher and higher levels of organization, cell, multicellular life, social animals that are multicellular, and then eventually vast societies like we built, and eventually we're, possibly global organization that we seem to be on the verge of. The internet is kind of like a global brain. If you view that as being part of the process, here's what the argument would be. That, as being part of the purpose, that our talking about our subjective experience plays a role in carrying organization to that, what is so far the final level, the global level. It plays a role in the congealing of social order. And certainly, people saying things like, wait a second, that hurt me when you said that, or when you did that. And the other person saying, well then, okay, I won't hurt you, but then you don't hurt me. This kind of discourse plays a role sometimes in social cohesion, right? And so you can imagine that if indeed purpose, however, in whatever form, was imparted, there's in some sense a larger purpose, if the term higher purpose freaks you out, a larger purpose unfolding through the workings of nature, then the function of consciousness, there's no function at the individual organism's level, but at the larger social level, the function of consciousness is to congeal social order and help sustain the overall trajectory toward higher and higher levels of organization. So that's the idea. Is that at least intelligible?
Yeah, I think I see the idea. One way of looking at it is you've at least given a potential function for talking about consciousness. Mm-hmm. Here is why you might expect that in certain groups, this belief that we are conscious and claims that we are conscious and claims to other people that you are conscious and so on could play an important social role in, for example, distinguishing us, the special conscious creatures, from others and isolating certain parts of the world as the loci of consciousness. Yeah, that could play some kind of role in special group identification and making us feel like we've got some special role in nature. I guess my worry would be, okay, this is a potentially convincing role for talking about consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I still worry, why do you need consciousness for that? And what is the role that consciousness is playing here? I suppose consciousness could facilitate talking about consciousness, and it's kind of plausible that it does, but it still leaves open the question of a mechanism. How on earth could consciousness be getting in, especially if consciousness is not something physical?
Right.
How on earth could it be actually getting in to the system and bringing about all this talking about consciousness?
Yeah, I think you almost have to think of it as an epiphenomenal consciousness that at some point just ceases to be epiphenomenal, again, by virtue of the nature of self-awareness or something, right? By virtue of the nature of a human level of self-awareness, that changes something. It's a kind of a latent influence and latent functionality. So in other words, throughout the history of life, there was no influence exerted by consciousness. Hence, it couldn't have a function.
But it was sitting around just waiting to play its role.
Well, yeah, I mean, look,
Manchurian candidate or something.
Well, but actually,
triggered for action.
But when you think about it, that is actually a feature of designed purposive systems. So, for example, human beings and many animals, they have reproductive equipment long before it is put to use. There are various things in the human body that start showing up, and if you had only seen their history up to that point, you'd go, what the hell is that for? But later it has a purpose. So that's actually, so if you agree that, if you'll accept the stipulation that maybe just as natural selection imbued individual organisms with purpose, then maybe some meta-natural selection process imbued natural selection with purpose, or some god did or some space alien did, then actually that part is very, very, that makes sense. That there would be latent functionality, features that exist before they have functional influence.
Well, in the usual cases, the features get selected in the first place by evolution because they had some other functionality. And this leads to one major worry, I take it, for your view, which is in some ways it shares some of the problems of epiphenomenalism, at least at the earlier stages of selection. Like if we want to say that that other primates and dogs and cats and fish have been conscious for all these years, there's at least a very strong question. What on earth is their consciousness doing, and how did their consciousness come to be selected?
Well,
and on the view you're outlining, I take it, well, maybe our consciousness is doing something, but their consciousness is not. Their consciousness is epiphenomenal, which you might think gives rise at least to many of the problems of epiphenomenalism, namely, how did that get selected, and how bizarre that this thing should be sitting around playing no role when the fish seems to feel pain and swims away from the painful stimulus. The pain feeling is playing no role. So you might worry that the view shares some of the problems of epiphenomenalism as well as some of the problems of interactionism.
I don't think it shares that problem. I mean, first of all, if indeed consciousness is epiphenomenal at kind of lower levels of organic life, fish and so on, then of course it wasn't selected. It couldn't be selected. Things can only be selected if they have influence on behavior. So the selection...
How did it get there if it wasn't selected?
Well, again, the selection has... Okay, let me get a little more specific. Lee Smolin has this theory that universes may replicate themselves through black holes, and so universes are selected to do things like create black holes and have certain kinds of stability that lead to reproduction. Now, some people, and I actually interviewed one of them who's, even as we speak, is on Meaning of Life TV, some people have taken this and suggested, well, maybe intelligent life plays a role in the reproduction. Maybe intelligent beings
create a lot of black holes
through
their technology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, they can only do that if they get to a technological point where they can create black holes, and they can only get to that point if social organization reaches a level of global cohesion. At least it seems to be. So let me just emphasize, the selection is not taking place at the level of individual organisms as with natural selection. It can't be the case that epiphenomenal consciousness is explained by that. It cannot in principle. The selection is taking place among universes. Some of them have the metaphysical property that life is accompanied by consciousness. And then as the universe matures, those do a better job of replicating. That's an example of the scenario. But a key feature of this is certainly that you're right, the functionality cannot exist at the individual level. The functionality has to exist at the larger social, or even kind of at the level of the whole ecosystem, however you want to look at it. So that's that.
I mean, if we had in the background, I mean, this kind of requires a view where consciousness has exactly one causal role, and that's to make us to issue reports about consciousness.
That's not its function.
If we took that as a background premise,
yeah,
that's all consciousness can do, and nothing else. I could see how maybe this selection of universe story would then get off the ground. I've got to say, I do find that a kind of weird and maybe in itself a slightly bizarre view of consciousness, that all it does is make us talk about consciousness.
Well, but
I mean,
wait.
if it's the kind of thing which can play a causal role in the physical world and can affect our talking about consciousness, once you've got some mechanism for it to do something, why not suppose it's somewhat more widespread, and that, for example, the pain does in fact help make us withdraw our hand from the flame, that experiencing red might have something to do with what painters do when they paint pictures.
Well, no, but I mean, I don't think it should be so trivialized. I mean, you're saying, wow, it's only to make us issue reports. No, that's not the function. The function is much grander.
Let's distinguish the function, what the telos, what it ends up doing for the universe, from the proximal causal role, what it actually does.
Well, right. Well, all kinds of things.
The proximal causal role is affecting.
All kinds of things seem trivial at a microscopic level. It's like, wait, the function of your whole immune system is just so this one cell can eat this other cell? No, but that headed off this disease that would have killed you. Okay, at the level of function, it's really important. However trivial a single instance of it seems.
You're going to need an amazing causal mechanism for some non-physical consciousness to get in and affect processes in the brain and start making us talking about it. Somehow you're going to have to solve the problem of the psychophysical nexus, consciousness affecting the brain. Once you've got some amazing mechanism which can do that, then why on earth would it just be limited to humans and just be limited to this one little small role of talking about consciousness? If we had a theory of such a mechanism, I'd be inclined to think, boy, well, why not put it to work in a much more widespread way? For example, the pain is making us move away from stimuli. The colors are helping affect our processing of color vision.
I mean, remember, though,
role for such a massive, wonderful mechanism.
It's a massive role. It saves the damn species, world, and universe, for God's sake. It's a massive role. And I mean, when you say, well, I might have put it to broader use, but remember, if it is a natural selection process, natural selection doesn't think things through like that. It's just like a mutation develops. One universe has this metaphysical dimension. It does better than the rest, and that's the end of the story.
I'm inclined to think that if there is this latent potentiality to play a causal role in the brain, some mechanism sitting around whereby consciousness can somehow affect brains right from the start, evolution ought to find a way to put that to work from the start. Why wait all these years until humans are around, and suddenly in the context of language and culture, let's make their lips move and talk about consciousness. I mean, surely evolution would find a way to put it to work earlier.
Because the mutation doesn't work that way. I mean, it didn't work that way. And besides, that's not essential at the level of the universe. Life was already doing a fine job of getting to our point in this scenario, and the challenge is getting us beyond it. But let me also say this. I mean, you're right that it would be nice to fill in this gap of, like, what is the mechanism by which an epiphenomenal consciousness leads to a report of it? But that's a problem that afflicts epiphenomenal consciousness to begin with. I mean, this comes closer to saving epiphenomenalism than anything else I've heard.
If consciousness is making us produce the reports, then consciousness is not, strictly speaking, epiphenomenalism.
As I said,
this is not epiphenomenalism. This is interactionism. Consciousness is doing something. And just to be clear, that is your view, right? Consciousness is in fact causing the reports? Or is that not your view?
Well, I think it's a hybrid view that for reasons we don't understand, and look, let's face it, no one has an explanation of consciousness that doesn't involve something we just can't understand. Nobody has a coherent, plausible, comprehensive theory. Okay,
I'm a little bit worried that, like many hybrid views, they may suffer from some aspects of the worst of both worlds.
Well,
like epiphenomenalism, the worry about how it got selected and what it does in these creatures, but then all the more so, like interactionism, the worry about how could it possibly be playing that causal role here in us? How is consciousness getting in and making us talk about
the premise? Well, I guess there's one of two premises. The premise I tend to entertain is that there is a kind of a, you know, a threshold that it is, you know, my dog does feel something when he wags his tail, but that feeling doesn't influence anything in his body. And that's the way it is all the way up until you get self-conscious, linguistically proficient organisms. And for reasons we don't understand, but again, there's something we don't understand in all these theories, that once you get to that threshold, there's a kind of a reflectiveness, and maybe it's a kind of a recursive, something metaphysically recursive. You know, actually, you know, one of your mentors was Doug. You worked for Doug Hofstadter. Maybe I should try this out. I should try this out on him, except I think he's in Dennett's camp, so let's not. But anyway, you know, some sort of mechanism kicks in. You know, that's the premise. The other one is the other possibility is the one you sketched out, where it's like on your weird epiphenomenalism planet, where for some reason we don't understand the evolution naturally leads to the report of consciousness, even though consciousness doesn't do anything. I tend to dismiss that because, look, there are all kinds of reports that would work just as well. You could just say, I insist that you not hit me, or I will hit you, period. You know, I don't have to refer to my internal state. I want this in exchange for giving you that. You could work it that way, and it is worked that way sometimes. But so I don't quite go with that. But anyway, this is, I think I've sketched kind of the contours.
If you don't go epiphenomenalism, I don't really see then how you've solved what was the biggest problem for any interactionist view all along, which is how on earth does consciousness get in and make a causal difference to, you know, make my mouth move.
Okay.
And so on, given that it sure looks like science is suggesting the brain as a closed system, and the action of every neuron is determined by the action of the neuron, the neurons that came before it, and so on. The big problem for any of these views was, how does something non-physical get in and make a difference? And right now I'm not hearing any proposal about that.
Well, right, but that just dooms epiphenomenalism generally.
Well, this is the problem. I see that as a problem for interactionism, the view that consciousness
plays a problem
role.
for
The worry is,
it's a problem for epiphenomenalism.
Find a mechanism consistent with physics.
It's a problem for epiphenomenalism. There is no plausible scientific Darwinian theory by which these animals evolve, and then some of them start saying, I have consciousness.
Let's distinguish the problem for epiphenomenalism, which is how did they evolve, from the problem for interactionism, which is how does consciousness actually get into the brain and play a causal role. I'm understanding your view now as interactionist. Consciousness is playing a causal role, at least in us. Consciousness does affect our brains, and I want to know, how on earth does that happen consistently with physics?
You know, we're at 39 minutes. What I would say is there is this part of the theory that you can't clearly sketch out, right? It's this threshold point where something that has been literally epiphenomenal starts leading to reports about itself. I grant that. And let's move on to your ideas on quantum physics, because I suspect they will illustrate that every theory has this part you can't sketch, right? This part that doesn't make clear sense, that you can't draw out on the chart what's going on here, right?
Can I say one more thing about your theory? Oddly, there's a version of your theory which I can see someone like Dan Dennett quite...
then I am abandoning it, but go ahead.
This is the view that, yes, well, the reason we talk about consciousness so much is that talking about consciousness really did play this big evolutionary role in social cohesion. It was really useful for us to feel as if we had this special property and to talk about it, to isolate us from the rest of nature, distinguish us from the rest of nature. But of course, then the Dennett-style view is going to add the twist. For that evolutionary purpose, there's no reason that consciousness itself needs to exist at all. We're just going to, evolution is going to favor certain self-models where we attribute this property to ourselves to distinguish us and so on. And that explains why it is we have such a strong and vivid intuition that we feel like we have this amazing property, consciousness, when in fact none of it exists. In fact, I recently did a reverse debate on consciousness with the physicist Carlo Rovelli, where I had to defend the view that consciousness doesn't exist, that consciousness was bullshit in the terms of the debate, and he was having to defend the view that consciousness plays a big role. And I took a version of this view. Consciousness the belief that we're conscious was just an evolutionarily selected self-model to make us feel special, but there's no reason to think it actually exists. Now, of course, it's hard to reconcile. The question is whether that does justice to the first-person data. But I can't imagine the Dennett's of the world taking on board much of what you said and just saying, let's forget the consciousness part.
Yeah, he would do that, and that's why it's not a version of my theory, because my theory involves the idea that consciousness is a real thing and that we do actually have feelings and experiences. I mean, also, that would involve a group selection that he wouldn't be drawn to and a bunch of things, but probably. But so that's, I wouldn't call that I would call that a warping of my theory, and I would condemn it.
But it does bring out that the key thing in your theory is that talking about consciousness plays this role.
That is when the function. That is when a previous. That is when the previously latent functionality becomes manifest. Yes.
That's when the Manchurian candidate gets activated.
Well, but again, this happens all the time in designed biological systems.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I maintain there simply is no. I mean, there's not even a view of what consciousness is that doesn't involve a part that you can't sketch out clearly. And much less a theory of what it does, and in fact, we with epiphenomenalism even, there is the famous water into wine theory. Like, okay, well, let's say the physical being influences the consciousness. Can you sketch that part for me? It's just like, we don't